The Catholic Church once dominated all of Western Europe, but then the Protestant Reformation split it up into dozens of new denominations, converting Northern Europe and spreading Christianity around the world. But how did the Protestant Reformation happen? Chapter 1. The Rise of Christianity. To understand the Protestant Reformation, we first need to understand Christianity itself. Christianity started in the 1st century in the Roman province of Judea. There, the religion of Judaism was prevalent, and Christianity was an offshoot of Judaism. Christianity teaches that a Jewish man called Jesus Christ existed, who said he was the son of the Jewish God, performed several miracles, and his followers formed the religion of Christianity based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. Whether Jesus actually existed or not is uncertain. However, we do know that various stories attributed to him are contradicted by archaeological evidence. But what we do know is that a group of people said to be Jesus' apostles began spreading the Christian faith. Christianity first spread in the region of Judea, converting Jewish people to Christianity. By the year 100, over 40 churches were established. Over time, Christianity split off from Judaism and began converting non-Jewish people as well. This allowed them to spread throughout the Roman Empire. By the 3rd century, they became such a threat to the Roman religion that the empire began persecuting the Christians. That was until 313. The Roman Empire just ended a civil war. The victor of that war was Emperor Constantine, and Emperor Constantine had converted to Christianity. When he took the throne, he made Christianity legal, and in 380, another emperor made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, doing away with the old Roman gods. This version of Christianity would eventually become Roman Catholicism. But as Christianity was becoming an established religion, they found that the clergy couldn't agree on a lot of things. So they held several meetings between prominent religious scholars, called theologians, to determine what Christianity should actually be, to find some sort of consensus among them. This largely worked, though a group of Christians who disagreed with these decisions split off from the rest of Christianity, forming Coptic Christianity, which became popular in Egypt and West Africa. They even have their own pope. Eventually, the Roman Empire disintegrated. The East became known as the Byzantine Empire, while the West fractured into hundreds of kingdoms. What unified those hundreds of kingdoms was Roman Catholicism. And as the Roman state disintegrated, the leader of Roman Catholicism, the popes, gained more power. In 756, the pope was granted control over Rome and the surrounding regions, making it the seat of Roman Catholicism for most of its history. As the power of the pope increased in the West, the Byzantine Empire resisted his influence. Over the centuries, this resulted in a split in the church, and on July 16, 1054, they split off from Roman Catholic Christianity to create their own Orthodox Christianity. And in the 7th century, Islam was founded in the Middle East. Those Muslims formed various empires over the centuries. They conquered much of North Africa, Spain, Portugal, and the Middle East. Over time, many of the Christians living in those regions converted to Islam. Chapter 2. Decline of the Roman Catholic Church. By the end of the 11th century, Catholicism had reached its limit with Islam to the south and Orthodoxy to the east, leaving Catholicism with Western and Central Europe. The Catholic Church tried to regain some of this territory, starting holy wars against the Muslims, for example. One of these was the Crusades, where they largely failed to retake the Middle East for Christendom. However, in Spain and Portugal, the Christians successfully reconquered it in 1492. Eventually, a new Islamic empire emerged in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire. They had an incredibly efficient bureaucracy for its time, allowing them to field professional soldiers in large numbers. For more details, please see our video on the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans turned the tide against Christianity and began invading Europe. The popes, instead of organizing an attack, now helped to organize the defense, serving as a unifying figure among Catholic rulers. This showed that Catholicism was on the defensive and in decline. And as the Ottoman threat became bigger, the power of the Pope became smaller. That's because with the constant threat of Ottoman invasions, the rulers of Europe began to copy them to create similar powerful armies that could stand against them. For this, they needed a larger bureaucracy to oversee the army, collection of taxes, economic policy, and much more, all with the goal of defense. Over time, European countries that succeeded became more powerful and conquered those who were less powerful. And the more powerful they became, the fewer allies they needed to defend themselves against Ottoman invasions, meaning that with every new war, they needed the Pope less and less, until by the 15th century, a small group of countries could defeat the Ottomans, rather than uniting dozens of armies through Christendom. The political influence of the Pope therefore declined. At the same time, the power of the Church in Western Europe only increased. Bishops became rulers, churches demanded taxes, and priests began selling religious services. At the same time, the money they received was being spent on glamour, crosses with jewels in them, marble altars, golden frames for their paintings, and much more. Catholic churches were centers of wealth in a time where starvation was a common occurrence. While most priests were not corrupt, the hoarding of gold alone raised eyebrows, even among the clergy themselves. And in the 14th and 15th centuries, this corruption reached such heights that even kings began resisting against the ever-increasing political power of the church. In France, at the start of the 14th century, for example, the king was in debt to the Knights Templar, a military Catholic holy order. The king wanted to get rid of church influence in his land, as well as get rid of his debt. This caused a political argument with the Pope, in which the Pope excommunicated the king, meaning he was cast out of the church. The king in turn arrested the Pope and had him killed. Then he forced the Catholic Church to elect a French Pope who would do whatever the French king told him. With the Pope on his side, on Friday, 13th of October 1307, hundreds of Knights Templar were arrested and killed, which is where we get Friday the 13th from. And with this victory, the French king was able to limit the taxation powers of the church in France, get rid of his debt, and take control of church lands. At the same time that kings were pushing against the power of the church, the clergy also began pushing back against Catholic teachings, such as a priest called John Wycliffe. He stated that the Catholic Church did not hold any power at all, that the church itself was a man-made creation with no basis in the Bible, and that all those churches, all those jewels, and all those ceremonies were completely meaningless. This was a radical idea at the time. Back then, religion and politics were deeply interwoven. For example, kings were crowned by bishops and priests, signaling that a king was the king because God chose him as the king. Challenging the king meant challenging God, and as a Christian, challenging God was not okay. By questioning the authority of the Catholic Church, he questioned the entire socio-political system in Western Europe. As a result, John Wycliffe was considered far too radical for his time, and his work did not become popular. However, there were those among the clergy who felt as he felt, who saw what he saw, and they began spreading his works among clergy in small numbers. At the time, theologians often debated religion. They had debate groups where they would meet to discuss religious matters, and debates became more critical of the church, questioning certain church traditions. However, those clergy were always in a minority and unable to actually change anything. Chapter 3. Martin Luther. For the sake of this video, Martin Luther was a Catholic priest. He was troubled with the possibility of salvation and began searching for answers in the Bible. He found it in Romans 1:17. The just shall live by faith. He concluded that only one's faith in God could bring salvation, and that churches, rituals, and holy sacraments were all meaningless drivel. That only by following the words of Christ can one reach heaven, meaning that the Catholic Church, according to him, had strayed from its true purpose. One practice he was most appalled by was something called indulgences. The way indulgences worked is that the Catholics believed that before a person was sent to heaven or hell, they would be in purgatory. Purgatory was suffering, but you could buy a document called an indulgence, and this indulgence would shorten your or your loved one's time spent in purgatory before being sent to heaven. The Catholic Church justified this by saying that saints have done so many good deeds here on earth that some of their holy goodness is still on the planet. By buying an indulgence, you are doing an act of charity. In exchange, you get some of this holy energy to shorten purgatory. The money was then spent on helping the poor, at least officially. But then, in 1515, indulgences were handed out to build the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Martin Luther and many other clergy wondered how building a lavish structure was supposed to help those who are suffering. And if you really need that much space, you could just build a couple of smaller churches for a fraction of the cost. Martin Luther worked in Wittenberg, which was ruled by a prince bishop. The prince bishop was in debt, and he took some of the money from selling indulgences to repay his loans. Martin Luther thought that this was corruption, and that the entire practice of indulgences should stop. According to him, nowhere in the Bible did it say indulgences existed. According to him, the Catholic Church had made it all up. And so Martin Luther decided he wanted to debate this issue, hoping that he could reform the church from within. Catholic theologians often had debates to discuss religious matters, and this was the perfect place for him to bring up his thoughts. And the way it worked is that a person would write a thesis. A thesis was a couple of sentences which detailed your main discussion point. To give a very silly example, let's say I post a thesis saying that Historyscope should turn the logo, my face, into a round pillow for people to sleep on. And then people could think of arguments for or against it, and then we'd hold a debate in the comment section about it. That's basically it. This thesis was then nailed to the front of the door of the Wittenberg University, which was right next to the church. On the door, everybody entering and leaving could see it. Other members of the clergy could read it, form their own ideas, and later meet for a debate. However, Martin Luther didn't have just one thesis, he wrote 95 theses. That was quite a lot, and so on October 31st, 1517, he nailed them to the front door of the castle. And for the next 2 years, he and his fellow theologians discussed his grievances with the church. However, this went nowhere, and in 1519 he was convinced the Catholic Church was beyond reform, that it was so incredibly broken and corrupt that it was impossible to change, and so he began publishing his work and spreading his ideas to his fellow clergy. In the early 16th century, the printing press was becoming commonplace in Europe. Almost every city had their own printing press. As a result, his works were easy to produce and easy to distribute. However, speaking out against the Catholic Church was illegal in most of Europe. The monarchies and the popes worked closely together, but in the empire Martin Luther worked in, that was not the case. That empire was called the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor had relatively little power within his own empire. This meant that each kingdom, city-state or duchy inside the empire had their own rules on enforcing religious laws. Some of them were either unable or unwilling to stop the spread of Luther's work, and that work then spread from one state to another. At the time, only about 5% of Germans could read, so it was easy to smuggle books into another city because those guards most likely weren't even able to read the document anyway. However, this did not work in places like Spain or Portugal, where the state was a lot more powerful and religious laws were strictly enforced. As part of this enforcement, the kingdoms therefore checked what printing presses were producing. As Martin Luther's work began to spread among clergy and regular people, he caught the attention of the Pope. The Catholics wanted to find some sort of compromise and were willing to listen to Luther. However, in the end they condemned him, his work, and all those who supported him at the Diet of Worms. Some German lords protested this decision, fearing a religious revolt in their region. They wrote a letter which they called a protestation, which is where we get the term Protestant from, though it would not be used for several decades by the people themselves. Then a year later, the Holy Roman Emperor was also getting concerned about issues in the church in his empire. He did not want a religious revolution on his hands, so he ordered Luther to appear before the Imperial Parliament in 1522, where he was called to retract his own statements. However, Luther refused and was outlawed. In doing so, he had become a hero to the common people, who saw him as a man who stood up to the corruption of the church. Chapter 4. Lutheranism. Luther advocated for a new type of church, one which he believed was closer to that of what Jesus Christ's apostles had created, one where the true church was an invisible union of all true Christians, that the church as an organization had no real power. and that a church building was nothing more than a building for people to practice religion, but not a political organization like the Catholic Church, and that priests should not hold any power either. They should focus on preaching Christianity, not politics. However, this brought up the issue of sacraments. In very simple terms, a sacrament is a Christian ritual in which one shows their grace towards God. The Catholic Church had 7: marriage, anointing the sick, confession, in which someone confesses their sins to a priest for spiritual guidance, confirmation, where a person receives wisdom and fortitude from God, Eucharist, in which Christians commemorate the Last Supper of Jesus Christ, holy orders such as deacons, priests, and bishops, baptism, in which holy water is put on a person's face, symbolizing purification and regeneration. And lastly, Holy Communion, in which Catholics consume the body and blood of Christ through a cookie and wine. However, according to Luther, only the last 2 were actually sacraments. He stated that marriage, anointing the sick, confession, confirmation, and Eucharist were not in the Bible, and were in fact ceremonies created by the Catholic Church. And he had already concluded that the Catholic Church held no true religious or spiritual power. Therefore, he concluded that these 5 sacraments were fake. That marriage, for example, was not a holy union, but just marriage. The Catholic Church argued that these 5 sacraments were holy and that they were told by God to create these new sacraments, that they were an extension of God's will on earth. And so Martin Luther concluded that if the Catholic Church could not be reformed, he would simply make his own church. And so he recruited people sympathetic to his cause to form a new clergy, one which did not spend money on golden crosses, would not take political power, and they would not create an overarching bureaucracy like the Catholic Church. Instead, he created an informal priesthood of what he deemed to be pious Christians who would then spread their new faith. This faith was first called Reformists because they simply wanted to reform Catholicism. However, today this group is known as Lutherans, named after Martin Luther after he died. These reformist priests would be different from Catholic priests in many ways. These priests were supposed to live pious lifestyles, without lavish ornaments or a large salary like the Catholic priests. And because marriage wasn't a sacrament according to them, it meant that celibacy was meaningless, and so priests were allowed to marry. But without a centralized church like the Catholics had, how were they going to select these priests? Well, they would let the congregation choose. You see, land at the time was divided into parishes, similar to a county but for churches. Each parish had their own church and priest, and the clergy had to provide religious services to all the members of that parish. And Lutherans decided that the priests would be elected by their own parish. People would vote for the most pious among them, and if a priest turned out to be corrupt, they could elect another one, thereby reducing corruption within the priesthood and making Lutheranism more popular. However, because they didn't see the point in celibacy, they also did not see the point in monks or nuns. In fact, Luther argued that God told humans to multiply, and so he considered celibacy to go against God's decrees. In fact, he was so opposed to the practice of nuns in particular that he wrote, "If women die in childbed, that does no harm. It is what they are made for." As a result of this, nuns became some of the strongest opponents to Lutheranism. Many nuns were noblewomen, and noblewomen were often married off to strange men. Those women often decided to become nuns to escape that life. It allowed them a degree of freedom few women had at the time. But if Luther was going to make all of these new priests and set up a whole new faith, he needed people to actually be able to read the Bible. At the time, the Bible was mostly available in Latin, and only nobles and clergy could read Latin. So he translated the New Testament, which is the part with Jesus and everything afterwards, into his native German in 1522, and the Old Testament, so that's everything before Jesus, in 1534. That way, he argued, people could read for themselves what the Bible said, and they would no longer have to rely on their priests to translate it for them. And he believed that if people simply read the Bible, they would all come to the exact same conclusion as he did. However, that did not happen. Chapter 5. The Protestant Reformation. As Luther began to spread his ideas and the German translation of the Bible, more and more people began to agree with parts of what he had to say, particularly people who were unhappy with their priest, church taxes, or prince-bishop. And in the German-speaking parts of the Holy Roman Empire, his works spread like wildfire, starting the Protestant Reformation. Just to be clear, Protestant refers to a very large variety of denominations that emerged after Martin Luther, such as Calvinism, Anabaptism, Puritanism, and many more. But they are all collectively known as Protestants. To spread Luther's ideas further, they tried including more regular people into the church sermons to get them to participate more. For example, until then singing in the church was done by clergy, but in 1524, Johann Witter published a hymn book, providing hymns for people to sing in church, a revolution in music at the time. It became so popular that almost all Christian denominations have adopted hymns into their own sermons. This in turn created musicians who experimented further, and some of the greatest composers of all time came from the Protestant German lands, such as Bach and Beethoven. As a result, the Protestant Reformation changed music around the world. However, all of these efforts did not actually create the rational debates Luther had hoped for. Instead, people turned his ideas into satire against the church, and a lot of people who were unhappy with the Catholic Church willingly bought this satire. This turned into populism and propaganda, which exacerbated the crimes of the priests. They compared monks to ravenous wolves and the Pope to a dragon. Some even began to call the Pope the Antichrist. And in 1524, this culminated in the German Peasants' War. This was not just a small uprising, this was one of the first large-scale popular uprisings in Europe. 300,000 peasants rose up in revolt against just a few thousand well-trained soldiers. And the peasants lost in 1525, unable to stand up to the power of heavy cavalry and steel plate armor. However, this defeat just made the peasants more upset with their government, but it also showed that Lutheranism wasn't just a small religious sect anymore, but a popular new denomination. Then the leaders inside the Holy Roman Empire began to convert as well. The first was the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, Albert Hohenzollern. But as you might remember, holy orders were a sacrament in Catholicism, but not in Lutheranism. And the Teutonic Knights were a holy order of soldiers. By turning Protestant, he turned his holy order into the Duchy of Prussia, which would one day unify most German speakers into Germany. The conversion of nobles was a problem to the Holy Roman Emperor. Officially, he was the defender of Catholicism inside the Holy Roman Empire. In that cause, he fought against Muslim pirates in the Mediterranean and Ottoman invaders in Hungary. But now, he was losing Catholics in his own empire. He tried to do something about it, but he had way too many wars to fight to actually do anything about it. In the meantime, Lutheranism just kept growing and eventually spread to Switzerland, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. And the Holy Roman Empire feared a second, even larger peasant revolt. So, in 1530, Emperor Charles V once again called Luther before the Imperial Parliament to present his faith, and once again they denounced him, and once again this caused more and more people to become Lutheran. And just as they had feared, this caused another rebellion. Except this time, several rulers of the Holy Roman Empire joined the Lutherans, meaning this wasn't just a peasants' rebellion anymore, this was civil war. And between 1546 and 1555, the Holy Roman Empire tore itself apart. Lutheran and Catholic rulers began attacking each other in order to gain territory. For the first time in a long time, it was possible to start a religious war with your neighbors inside Western Europe, as long as that neighbor had a different Christian faith than yours. In the end, the war resulted in a stalemate. After 9 years of war, they finally signed the Peace of Augsburg, which allowed each state within the Holy Roman Empire to choose whether they wanted to be Catholic or Lutheran. As a result, Lutherans now had a base from which they could spread their beliefs to northwestern and northern Europe, slowly converting them to Lutheranism. Sweden broke away from Catholicism in 1527 and Denmark and Norway in 1536, but not all countries became Lutheran. Chapter 6. Calvinism. Calvinism started in Switzerland. In the early 16th century, there was a Swiss theologian called Ulrich Zwingli, and he agreed with Luther on almost everything. And he was a very charismatic man who spent the 1520s advocating for church reform in Switzerland. At the time, Switzerland was a collection of largely independent states who joined together in the Swiss Confederacy, with each state managing their own religious affairs similar to the Holy Roman Empire. And several of those states were not successful at rooting out the Lutherans, and by 1524 they had gained so much power that they went into the churches of Zurich for 2 weeks to dismantle all the lavish ornaments. A year later, Latin religious sermons were replaced with German religious sermons. During this period, a man called Grebel read the Bible and concluded that baptizing infants was not found in the Bible, so he began baptizing adults. They became known as rebaptizers, or as we know them today, the Anabaptists. By the 1530s, Switzerland had its own religious civil war, and in 1531, Zwingli himself was killed in that war. This left the Lutheran Church in Switzerland largely leaderless until another man came to Switzerland, a man called John Calvin. He was originally from France and had been banished because he was a Lutheran. He fled to Switzerland, and 2 years later, in 1536, he became the de facto leader of the Swiss Lutheran movement. And he would eventually form his own Christian denomination, which slightly deviated from Luther, called Calvinism. One of the things that made them different is that Calvin believed that a person could become a saint and that the clergy can indeed elect people to be saints based on their good work. According to Luther, this was nonsense and nowhere found in the Bible. And if a person truly was that good, then there was no need to ascribe sainthood to them. Upon death, they would simply go to heaven. Another disagreement was that Calvin opted for a much more open approach. Instead of fighting a war to force religion onto others, they would instead try to get them to willingly join. And to set an example, he would spend the next 2 decades debating and arguing with the Swiss elites to live a more pious lifestyle and to gain more followers among the commoners. He had settled in Geneva, and it became a bastion for Lutherans who were banished from France. By 1550, many had become Calvinist, and they were now in the majority, and by 1560 Switzerland had largely converted to Calvinism, thereby giving them a safe base to start converting new people. Seeing as they had so many French refugees, they began sending some of them back as missionaries, and throughout the 1550s and 60s they began converting French nobility to their cause. Then the people were converted, and eventually various Catholic churches had their lavish ornaments removed, just like in Switzerland. And of course, because they were French, they even held mock executions for some of the statues. And France now had the same issue the Holy Roman Empire faced. Their own nobility was converting to a different religion, even though the King of France was supposed to be the protector of Catholicism within France. And this became worse when in 1560 the King of France died, and he was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, meaning that his government was in charge of ruling the country. And that government tried, just like in the Holy Roman Empire, to find some sort of compromise with the Calvinists. However, the French government also rejected this new faith and declared Catholicism as the official religion of France. 2 years later, in 1562, France descended into a religious civil war lasting all the way until 1598. 36 years. Eventually, Catholic, Calvinist and Lutheran countries joined the war until eventually the Catholics won in a narrow victory. To avoid further bloodshed, Calvinists were given limited rights to worship their religion in private, and in the process, 2 to 4 million people had to die. In the meantime, Calvinism was also spread to other parts of Europe, such as the Holy Roman Empire, where it tried converting Lutherans to their cause. In Hungary, Poland and Austria, they were rooted out by the governments, and the Christians living under the Ottoman Empire or Orthodox Christianity were hard to convert. The Catholic Church had little power there, meaning that there was little to rage against in the first place. A disciple of Calvin, called John Knox, brought Calvinism to Scotland. The Scottish Calvinists were known as Presbyterians, a term that refers to the church government ruled by elders known as presbyters. Later, they converted the Irish, who liked Calvinism because it opposed Catholicism, and Catholic England began invading Ireland around the same time, meaning Calvinism became a way to resist the English. And just as the Irish hated the English, in the 16th century the Dutch hated the Spanish. At the time, this part of the world was called the Low Countries, and it was part of the Spanish Empire. Spain was strictly Catholics, and so a lot of Dutch people converted to Calvinism and Lutheranism in order to show their hatred for Spain. The Spanish, on the other hand, were afraid of a rebellion, similar to what France, Switzerland and the Holy Roman Empire had already gone through, and so they began rooting out Lutherans and Calvinists in the Low Country. In turn, the Dutch became even more Protestant, and eventually, in 1566, the Dutch destroyed church ornaments from hundreds of churches in an event called the Beeldenstorm, which roughly translates to attack on images and statues. This then resulted in the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. But not all Christian art was destroyed. Those which weren't destroyed were taken away to become historical artifacts, starting some of the first museum collections in modern Europe. Chapter 7. Anglicism. One of the most successful Protestant movements, however, was in England. At first, the Protestants were not very successful. However, then the British king, called Henry VIII, had a problem. He could not have a son. He needed a son to have a male heir, and he believed the problem was with his wife. So he wanted a divorce to get a new wife to get an heir. To get a divorce, he needed permission from the Pope. However, the cousin of Henry's wife was the Holy Roman Emperor, and if the Pope allowed the divorce, the Holy Roman Emperor might just attack him. And so the Pope decided to not make a decision at all. After all, you can't make the wrong choice if you don't make a choice at all. Henry grew impatient and decided that if the Catholic Church wouldn't grant him a divorce, then he would simply make his own church, an English church, called the Church of England. At first, the Church of England was fundamentally Catholic. In 1534, they declared the king the head of the church instead of the Pope. In 1539, they reaffirmed Catholic teachings, aside from the Pope being the leader, and they rejected Protestant teachings. This splitting away from the Catholic Church was very popular among peasants who liked not having to pay taxes to that church. In 1551, clergy were allowed to marry, just like Lutheran priests, and in 1559 they repealed various pro-Catholic laws, shifting slowly towards Protestantism until, by the 17th century, the Church of England was regarded as just another Christian denomination derived from Protestantism, similar to Calvinism or the Anabaptists. There were many Catholics who resented this transition and emigrated to the Americas, while at the same time many Protestants believed that the transition wasn't happening fast enough and also moved to the Americas. These groups would set up their own religious colonies which would one day become the United States of America. Anglicism by the 17th century had become its own Protestant denomination, and as part of being Protestant, they saw the world differently. You see, before the Protestant Reformation, people believed a person was rich or poor based on the favor of God. For example, if a person was homeless, it meant they had lost that favor. The church would then provide charity to this person in the form of money and spiritual guidance, basically telling them that they are living their lives wrong and how they should change it to appease God. However, Protestants did not believe God had such a direct effect on earth. They believed poverty resulted from two things. The first was laziness. They believed that someone becoming an alcoholic was because that person was lazy rather than having mental issues. As a result, they believed these people should be forced to work, with a system called indentured servitude. With this system, a person would temporarily become a slave. Governments had long sold criminals into indentured servitude. But now they began making new laws, making things that they considered lazy to be illegal, allowing them to arrest, enslave, and sell their own people by the millions. The second reason for poverty, they believed, was a person lacked the necessary means to stop being poor. For example, a farmer without land can't farm. Therefore, they should set up training programs, allocate farmland, and give a home to stay in. They did not believe the church should provide this type of charity, however. While charity was a good thing according to them, it was not the job of the church to provide it. The church should provide religious services. And as a result, this job fell onto the local governments. The first major city to implement such programs were in London in 1514, and was soon followed in the 1530s when governments changed their state religion to Lutheranism. But this way of thinking meant that your piety did not influence your wealth. and Protestants started believing that being rich or poor was instead determined by one's own work. And they created a belief that if a person worked hard, they would become rich, and that the richest people were therefore the most hardworking and the most worthy of that wealth, and that being poor was a matter of whether or not you were lazy. And the Protestant English and Dutch created a rudimentary new economic system based on this belief: capitalism. Chapter 8. The 30 Years' War. By the 17th century, France had just gotten out of a major war with Calvinists. The Spanish were fighting a war against Lutheran and Calvinists in the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire had already finished their religious war decades earlier. At this point, England was moving away from the Catholic Church, and Scandinavia had been converted as well. Lutheranism had now become an entrenched religion in Europe. Religious arguments were now generations old, and the idea of unifying Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics was now clearly impossible, and so wars between the two sides only continued. But up until this point, wars were largely fought within one country. They might have foreign supporters, but they were clearly civil wars. That changed in 1618, when a major war broke out in Europe, pitting Lutheran North against Catholic South. It started relatively small in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. Calvinists wanted to replace their Catholic leader with a Calvinist leader. The emperor defeated them easily. He reasoned that this had weakened the Protestant cause and that he could do what Charles V could not: outlaw Lutheranism and Calvinism. As a result, the Peace of Augsburg was overturned. However, a lot of Catholic rulers who supported the emperor were worried this would cause another civil war. They did not want their lands ravaged by enemy armies and withdrew their soldiers and support from the emperor. This gave the Calvinist and Lutheran forces time to regroup. They sent a message to the now Protestant king of Sweden, asking him for support, and the Swedish army turned the tide against the Catholics. As a result, the Catholics asked for support from France and Spain. The Dutch were already at war with Spain and therefore automatically became allies with the Lutherans. And lastly, the UK joined the war on the side of the Protestants as well, seeking to weaken both France and Spain. And as a result, Western and Central Europe entered the 30 Years' War in 1816, with Protestant North fighting against Catholic South. In the end, 4.8 million people died in the war, but neither side could secure a victory. Eventually, in 1648, the leaders of Europe came together to form a new kind of peace, the Treaty of Westphalia, and they decided that Protestants, Calvinists, and Catholics could each practice their religion in private if they had a different state religion. As long as they did not openly preach or build churches, they were essentially allowed to worship in private as they wished. Afterwards, religious wars between Protestants and Catholics largely stopped. The main reason for this was France. Remember how I said earlier that European countries began building larger armies and bureaucracies to defend themselves against the Ottomans? Well, France was the fastest at that process, and as a result, they became the dominant power in Europe. And if any Protestant invaded the Catholics, they would have to face France. But if France invaded a Protestant nation, then the other Protestants rarely came to their aid, fearing France would attack them too. Chapter 9. The Catholic Reformation. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the Catholics saw their influence decline across Northern Europe. Only Portugal, Spain, Italy, and France had held on to their Catholicism. There was a real fear the Catholic Church might one day stop existing. To prevent the total collapse of Catholicism, the Church began implementing a series of reforms now known as the Catholic Reformation. The main goal of these reforms was to prevent further offshoots of Catholicism emerging and to double down on Catholic teaching. And so the Pope set up reform councils filled with Catholic theologians. Between 1548 and 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, they created a strict interpretation of Catholicism. In the process, standardized education was introduced for clergy. From now on, they would all learn exactly the same teachings. Cardinals would become bureaucrats directly serving the Pope. They would closely monitor and implement church policy to make sure nobody deviated from Catholicism. They limited the spending of individual churches, thereby reducing the abilities of priests to be corrupt. They introduced the confession box. Up until that moment, confession was done face to face, allowing a preacher to know who you are and might blackmail you with that information you confess to them. But with the confession box, this became a lot harder. And the last major reform I'll mention is doubling down on imagery. In order to resist the Protestant idea that imagery of religious events was blasphemy, they instead presented it as a perfect way to teach children or foreigners, to show them in a painting what might not be possible in words. When I was in primary school, my class went to a church where they used to show images to teach us Catholicism, for example. To implement these rules, there were often persecutions along with them. Before the end of the 30 Years' War, there were persecutions against various groups of people. In the Americas, they were afraid that people were still worshipping the old gods and killed hundreds of people per persecution to find possible offenders. One of the most famous persecutions was that of the witches. During the Middle Ages, witch hunts were rare. While many people at the time believed in witches, they were not actively afraid of them. The same way that today a lot of people think that there is alien life somewhere out there, but most of them are not actively afraid of an alien invasion. But during this era of heightened fear for anyone who wasn't Catholic, they also turned to hunting witches. However, there was a small problem. Witches don't exist, and it's impossible to persecute people who don't exist. However, if you're in charge of finding witches, you need to show results. And so, completely innocent people all over Europe were convicted of witchcraft and killed or banished. Usually women, but also men. These efforts seem to have actually worked to reinforce Catholicism. By the year 1700, Catholicism had made a comeback and had even begun converting Protestants back to Catholicism. But all these efforts would only secure the current Catholic lands. If they wanted to get new followers, they would need to go overseas. Chapter 10. Religious colonization. Around the time Luther began publishing his work, Catholic Spain and Portugal began colonization. At first, colonization was economical and political. It was a place to trade, somewhere to capture slaves, and a way for ambitious nobles to conquer new territory to rule for them and their children. Then, in the 1520s, the Spanish began conquering Native American kingdoms and empires. They would keep the native system in place, but replace the Native American people in charge with Spanish people. So the Aztec emperor was replaced with a Spanish governor, and Aztec priests were replaced with Catholic priests. They began sending missionaries and putting limitations on religious expression for decades, until only Catholicism was allowed. The Catholic Church suddenly had millions of Native Americans it could potentially convert, and throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the Spanish and Portuguese colonization of the Americas was justified by being presented as a religious mission to convert non-believer to the one true faith. Yet, those Native Americans were still heavily discriminated against. They were not allowed to join the priesthood until 1794, and the first pope born in the Americas was only elected in 2013, over 500 years after the first Native Americans converted to Catholicism. About a century after the Catholics started colonizing, the Protestants joined as well, particularly with the Dutch and the English, and a lot of Protestants from modern-day Germany followed them. As a result, today a third of US citizens are of German descent. And in the case of Protestants, there were two types of colonists. There were Lutherans who moved to the Americas for economic reasons, and then there were the other Protestant denominations, such as Anabaptists, Puritans, and several others, who moved to the Americas to escape persecution in Europe, generally becoming English colonies. But there was also the rest of the world. In Asia, Protestants and Catholics tried to convert the Asian populations, however with limited success. At first they were quite successful, however as soon as a ruler became aware of foreigners converting their people, Christianity of all kinds was usually banned. As a result, until the 21st century, Christianity in Asia was largely small isolated churches. And this was the Protestant Reformation. If you like this video, then please leave a like and subscribe and press the notification bell. If you want to see more videos right now, then on the left there is a video about why the USA is still very Christian to this day, or on the right a video picked specifically for you. This was Avery from History Scope. Thank you for watching.